The Meek Shall Inherit the Earth, a 5-part series by Larkey and Atlantean Astrology. Part 4, The Danger of Meekness as a Tool for Social Control. Throughout history, meekness has been presented as a noble virtue, one of humility, patience, and gentleness. However, when examined through the lens of power dynamics, this seemingly virtuous quality can be understood as a potent tool for social control, subduing populations, suppressing dissent, and maintaining systems of power. Whether wielded by religious institutions, political rulers, or elites, promoting meekness as passive submission ensures that a compliant populace is easier to govern, keeping individuals from questioning the status quo or seeking spiritual liberation. The traditional concept of meekness, interpreted as submission and passivity, serves as the perfect mechanism to create such compliance. By encouraging people to embrace this form of meekness, powerful institutions, both religious and secular, have historically ensured that the majority of the population remains passive, choosing to follow the rules of the land rather than challenge the structures that oppress them. This section will explore how meekness has been weaponized to suppress critical thought and stifle spiritual growth, contrasting it with Jesus' true message, one that warns that the meek, through reincarnation, will inherit the earth again and again until they transcend their spiritual blindness. Meekness as a tool for political control. In the context of political control, meekness has been used as an ideological weapon to maintain social order. Rulers throughout history have promoted the idea that submission to authority is not only necessary for societal stability, but also a moral obligation. By promoting meekness, they have convinced people that passivity and obedience are virtuous, while resistance or rebellion are dangerous and even sinful. Take the Roman Empire, which ruled over the Jewish people during Jesus' time. The Romans understood that true control came not only through force, but through the subjugation of the mind. By allowing local religious leaders to promote the idea that submission and meekness were spiritual virtues, they ensured that the majority of the population remained compliant, following the rules of the empire rather than challenging its oppression. For the Jewish people, religious leaders like the Pharisees and Sadducees reinforced this idea. They preached submission to the law of Moses, as well as the Roman law, encouraging people to accept their suffering as part of God's plan. Meekness in this context was not a virtue of spiritual strength or humility before God, but a means to ensure that people did not rise up against Roman oppression. The meek were those who accepted their place in society without question, easily controlled by both religious and political authority. However, Jesus' message was radically different. He did not come to promote submission to oppressive systems, but to challenge them. When he said that the meek will inherit the earth, Matthew 5:5, it wasn't a promise of reward, but a warning. Jesus' statement could be interpreted as a teaching that the meek, those who remain spiritually passive and fail to awaken to deeper truths, will inherit the earth through reincarnation, returning to the material world until they learn the lessons necessary for spiritual growth. This interpretation offers a stark contrast to the idea that meekness leads directly to salvation. Religious manipulation of meekness and the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church has long promoted meekness as a central Christian virtue, emphasizing humility, gentleness, and obedience to God. However, this teaching has also been used to promote submission to church authority, ensuring that the faithful remain loyal to both religious and political power structures. The Church's emphasis on meekness aligns with its historical role in promoting obedience, often discouraging critical thought or spiritual exploration outside the institution's authority. Pope Francis, in his 2020 teaching on the Beatitudes, presented meekness as a way to avoid conflict and maintain inner peace. While this interpretation is valuable for promoting nonviolence and trust in God's will, it also reinforces a version of meekness that discourages the faithful from questioning authority. The Church's promotion of meekness as a spiritual virtue ensures that people remain submissive, accepting their place in the world without challenging the established order. This stands in stark contrast to Jesus' life and ministry. Jesus and his disciples were anything but passive in the face of religious and political oppression. Jesus confronted the Pharisees, Matthew 23, challenged their legalism, and overturned tables in the temple, John, February 13th, 16. His followers, especially Peter and Paul, boldly defied both Jewish and Roman authorities, preaching the gospel even when it meant imprisonment or death. Their actions reflect a spiritual boldness that directly challenges the traditional interpretation of meekness as passive submission. This disconnect suggests that institutional Christianity has manipulated the idea of meekness to serve its own ends, using it as a tool of social control. Reincarnation and the original meaning of Psalm 37. Before the coming of the Messiah, the concept of meekness was tied to earthly promises. Psalm 37, for example, promises that the meek shall inherit the earth, Psalm 37:11. In the context of the Old Testament, this referred to the promised land of Israel, a tangible inheritance for those who followed God's commandments. For the Jewish people, inheriting the earth was a material blessing directly tied to their covenant with God. However, even with the arrival of Jesus, the meaning of meekness in Psalm 37 remained the same. When Jesus said, "The meek will inherit the earth," he was not introducing a new concept, but affirming that those who remain spiritually passive, those who fail to recognize him as the Messiah, will continue to inherit the earth. This refers to a cycle of reincarnation where the meek, due to their refusal to embrace spiritual awakening, are bound to the material world. They will keep returning to earth until they finally learn the necessary lessons for spiritual growth and transcendence. The meek are not progressing toward the kingdom of heaven. Instead, they remain stuck in this earthly cycle because of their continued passivity. This understanding does not challenge the meaning of meekness, but rather exposes how the Church's interpretation has been used to control people by promising an eternal reward. Instead of viewing meekness as a path to spiritual salvation, Jesus' words can be seen as a warning. Those who stay in a state of meekness will inherit earthly reincarnation, not the kingdom of heaven. This calls for a greater emphasis on spiritual action and growth, refuting the idea that mere passive submission is sufficient for salvation. The false promise of inheritance. One of the most insidious aspects of meekness as a tool of social control is the false promise of inheritance. Throughout history, the meek have been told that their submission will be rewarded, not in this life, but in the next. This promise of future inheritance has been used to keep people passive, convincing them that their suffering and obedience will lead to rewards in heaven rather than encouraging them to seek justice and truth in the present. However, if we interpret Jesus' words about the meek inheriting the earth as a warning of reincarnation, this promise takes on a different meaning. The meek, rather than ascending to heaven, may remain bound to the material world, reincarnating until they achieve spiritual liberation. This interpretation suggests that meekness, when it manifests as passive submission, delays spiritual growth rather than advancing it. Instead of inheriting eternal life, the meek inherit the earth, and with it the cycles of suffering and ignorance that come with material existence. The true path to spiritual liberation. In contrast to the manipulated meekness promoted by institutions of power, Jesus' true message offers a path to spiritual liberation, one that requires courage, resistance, and the pursuit of truth. Jesus did not come to reinforce the systems of control that governed his society. He came to challenge them. His teachings consistently called for a rejection of worldly values of power, wealth, and status, and a commitment to the higher values of love, justice, and spiritual truth. The kingdom of heaven that Jesus spoke of was not a place for the submissive and compliant. It was a realm for those who were willing to seek truth, to challenge authority, and to break free from the chains of religious and societal control. Those who enter the kingdom of heaven are not the meek in the traditional sense, but those who have the courage to resist the systems of power that keep them in bondage. They are the spiritually awakened, those who have illuminated themselves to the deeper truths of God's kingdom and who live by its values, even when those values conflict with the rules of the land. Ultimately, the concept of meekness, while presented as a virtue, has been consistently manipulated by institutions of power to maintain compliance and submission. Jesus' message, when truly understood, reveals that the meek will remain tied to the material world, continually inheriting the earth through reincarnation until they awaken spiritually. This is not a reward, but a consequence of spiritual passivity. Jesus came not to reinforce systems of control, but to liberate souls, calling them to embrace truth, resist oppression, and actively seek the kingdom of heaven. Only through spiritual boldness and awakening can individuals break the chains of reincarnation and transcend the limits of the earthly realm, fulfilling the deeper truth of his message.